Around the year 1333, the North African traveler Ibn Batuta arrived at the ruins of Merv. Once 500,000 souls had walked these streets. Now, only owls and wild dogs remained. He wandered through empty markets and crumbled mosques. The silence was absolute. The greatest city on the Silk Road had become a graveyard. How does a metropolis vanish in a single generation? This wasn't just conquest. This was a reset, a shattering of the old world order that would birth something entirely new. The answer lay in a force that had swept out of the Mongolian steppe a century before, a force that would connect China to Persia, Baghdad to Moscow, and inadvertently drag Europe into the modern age. This is the story of how the Mongols changed the world forever. The boy who would become Genghis Khan was born clutching a blood clot in his fist. The Mongols saw this as an omen. He would be a warrior. His name was Temujin. His father, Yasuge, was poisoned when the boy was 8 years old. Temujin's mother, Hoelun, was abandoned by her tribe, left to die on the frozen banks of the Onon River with her children. They survived on rats and roots. Temujin learned to hunt alone in the mountains. He had no teachers, no tribe, no future. When he was 16, his wife Berta was kidnapped by the Merkit people. For months, she was gone. Temujin gathered a small band of friends and rode into the night to find her. They found the Merkit camp under a full moon. Temujin called out her name. Berta heard him, leapt from a cart, and ran. He almost struck her, thinking she was an enemy. Then he saw her face. The raid was over. She was the only thing he wanted. But this rescue changed everything. Suddenly, Temujin had obligations. He had allies. He also had enemies who would come for him again. He began to fight, small battles, then larger ones. But he realized there was no end to steppe warfare. Every year, tribes raided each other. Every year, the cycle repeated. So Temujin decided to change the rules. He would kill the leaders and absorb their followers. One by one, the tribes fell. By 1206, he had united the Mongols under a single banner. At a great gathering on the shores of Blue Lake, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the Great Khan. The steppe nomads, who had spent centuries fighting each other, were now one nation. But what comes after unification? How do you keep a warrior people united in peacetime? The answer was simple. You don't stop fighting. Genghis Khan understood that his new nation needed purpose. The steppe had always been a place of raids and revenge. He would transform that chaos into something far more organized. He restructured Mongol society around the military. Warriors were organized into units of 10, called Arban. 10 Arban formed 100-man Zagan. 10 Zagan formed 1,000-man Mingan. And 10 Mingan formed a Tumen, an army of 10,000 horsemen. This wasn't just military organization. It was social engineering. The old clan loyalties that had torn the steppe apart for centuries were replaced by a meritocracy. Your rank depended on your skill, not your bloodline. Genghis Khan also introduced a new legal code, the Yasa. It outlawed the kidnapping of women, the theft of livestock, and the enslavement of fellow Mongols. These weren't abstract laws. They were personal. Each one addressed a wound from his own life. He also guaranteed religious freedom. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and shamans all received equal protection under Mongol law. This wasn't idealism. It was pragmatism. Religious conflicts had fractured the steppe for generations. By removing religion as a source of division, he removed a potential weakness. The Mongols now had unity, structure, and law, but they were still nomads living on the edge of survival. The steppe could only support so many people. So Genghis Khan turned his gaze south, toward the walled cities of China, the oasis kingdoms of Central Asia, and the wealthy empires of Persia. The unification of the Mongols was complete. The conquest of the world was about to begin. The Mongol military wasn't just an army. It was a machine, precision engineered for speed, adaptability, and total war. Every warrior rode with 5 spare horses. This meant a Mongol army could cover more than 100 kilometers in a single day. Chinese and Persian armies, weighed down by infantry and supply wagons, moved at a crawl by comparison. The Mongols lived off their herds. They drank fermented mare's milk. They ate meat tenderized under their saddles during the day's ride. In desperate times, they would open a vein on their horse's neck and drink the blood directly. They needed no supply lines. They carried no baggage trains. They could appear anywhere, strike, and vanish before the enemy could respond. Their primary weapon was the composite bow. Layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together to create a weapon of terrifying power. It could fire an arrow 300 meters. That's farther than an English longbow, but compact enough to be drawn from horseback. A Mongol warrior could fire 20 arrows per minute while riding at full gallop. They practiced a technique called the Parthian shot, turning in the saddle to fire backward while retreating. To an enemy, it looked like the Mongols were fleeing. Then the arrows came. But the real genius of Mongol warfare wasn't the weapons. It was the strategy. The Mongols had perfected a hunting technique called the nerge, the noose. Thousands of riders would spread out across the steppe, forming a vast circle around their prey. Then, over days or even weeks, they could tighten the circle, driving everything inside toward the center. Genghis Khan applied this to war. His armies would advance on multiple fronts, spreading panic and driving refugees toward the cities. The cities would fill with terrified civilians, draining their food and water. By the time the Mongols arrived at the walls, the defenders were already starving. The Mongols also weaponized terror. They spread rumors of their invincibility. They exaggerated their numbers. They drove captives ahead of them to fill in moats and scale walls, forcing defenders to kill their own people or watch their defenses crumble. When a city surrendered, the Mongols showed mercy. They looted the treasury but spared the population. When a city resisted, they made an example of it. Every man, woman, and child was killed. The message was clear: surrender or die. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was psychological warfare. After the first few massacres, cities began opening their gates without a fight. The Mongol war machine was efficient, ruthless, and terrifyingly effective. It turned steppe nomads into the most feared military force on Earth. And now, with China's wealth in their sights, they were ready to test it against the most powerful empire in the world. In 1211, Genghis Khan received an insult that would seal the fate of northern China. The new emperor of the Jin dynasty, the Golden Khan, sent envoys demanding tribute. The Mongols were expected to bow, to acknowledge Jin supremacy, to remain obedient vassals on the edge of the steppe. Genghis Khan asked the envoys who this new emperor was. They told him, Prince Shao of Wei. The Khan turned his face south and spat. I thought the emperor of the Middle Kingdom should be a man blessed by heaven. Can he be such an ordinary and weak man? Why should I show him respect? Then he mounted his horse and rode north. The envoys returned to Beijing in shock. They had just witnessed a declaration of war. Genghis Khan climbed the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun and prayed to Tengri, the god of the great blue sky. For 3 days, he sought guidance. When he descended, his decision was made. The eternal blue sky has promised us victory and vengeance. In the spring of 1211, 200,000 Mongol horsemen crossed the Gobi Desert. With them came 500,000 spare horses, herds of sheep and goats, and enormous supply carts pulled by oxen. They brought Chinese siege engineers who had defected from the Jin. They brought catapults and fire lances, early gunpowder weapons that could spray flames across city walls. This wasn't a raid. It was an invasion. The Jin dynasty ruled over 50 million people. Their armies numbered 600,000 men, mostly armored pikemen and crossbowmen. They had gunpowder bombs, repeating crossbows, and centuries of military tradition. On paper, the Mongols didn't stand a chance. But the Mongols didn't fight on paper. They attacked on multiple fronts simultaneously. One army swept into the east, another drove through the west. The Jin couldn't tell where the main force was. They couldn't coordinate a response. The Mongols moved faster than any army the Chinese had ever seen. Jin forces would march to defend the city, only to find the Mongols had already moved on. By the time reinforcements arrived, the city was in ruins. The Mongols also turned the Jin's strengths against them. China's massive population became a liability. As Mongol armies devastated the countryside, millions of refugees fled to the walled cities. The cities filled beyond capacity. Food ran out. Disease spread. The defenses were overwhelmed before the siege even began. The Mongols drove captives ahead of them to fill in moats and scale walls. Defenders faced an impossible choice: kill their own people or watch their fortifications collapse. City after city fell. The Mongols reached the walls of Beijing, then called Zhengdu, in 1214. It was one of the largest cities on earth, defended by walls 12 meters high and ringed by a triple moat. The Mongols laid siege, but plague began to spread through their camp. The summer heat was unbearable. Genghis Khan offered terms: a massive tribute in gold, silk, and slaves, and he would withdraw. The Jin emperor agreed. The Mongols rode back across the Gobi Desert, their camels laden with treasure. But the Jin emperor made a fatal mistake. He fled Beijing and moved his capital south to Kaifeng, behind the Yellow River. To the Mongols, this looked like preparation for renewed war. Genghis Khan wheeled his armies around and returned. This time, there would be no mercy. Beijing held out for 8 months. When it finally fell in June 1215, the Mongols sacked the city for a month. Fires burned so long that a Chinese envoy passing through years later reported the ground was still greasy with human fat. The Jin dynasty fractured. northern China descended into chaos. Warlords carved up the territory. Some pledged loyalty to the Mongols. Others fled south to the Song dynasty. Many simply fought for survival. The Mongol conquest of northern China would take another 2 decades to complete. But the outcome was never in doubt. China, the most advanced civilization on Earth, had been broken by an army of steppe nomads who couldn't read or write, who lived in felt tents, and who measured wealth in horses. The world had just learned a terrifying lesson. Walls, armies, and ancient dynasties meant nothing against the Mongol war machine. With northern China bleeding and the Jin dynasty in ruins, Genghis Khan could have continued his conquest. But in 1218, he made a different choice. He wanted peace. Or at least, he wanted trade. The Mongol Empire now controlled a vast stretch of the Silk Road, from the edges of China all the way to the Caspian Sea. Genghis Khan understood that an empire couldn't survive on war alone. His people needed goods, his treasury needed gold, and the cities under his rule needed commerce to prosper. So he sent a trade delegation west, 450 merchants, led by an Indian man named Jafar. They traveled with a caravan of Bactrian camels loaded with Chinese silk, gold, silver, jade, and furs. The wealth they carried was staggering. Some sources claim they brought a nugget of pure gold as large as a camel's neck. This wasn't just a trading mission. It was a statement. The Mongols were announcing themselves as a legitimate power, one that respected trade, protected merchants, and sought peaceful relations with its neighbors. The caravan's destination was the Khwarazmian Empire, the largest Muslim kingdom in the world. It stretched from Afghanistan to Turkey, controlling the wealthy oasis cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv. These were the jewels of the Silk Road, cities where scholars debated philosophy in marble courtyards, and merchants traded spices from India, silks from China, and perfumes from Arabia. The rulers of this empire was Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad. He was a conqueror, proud and ambitious. Some in his court flattered him by calling him the new Alexander. Genghis Khan sent a message with the caravan. I am the sovereign of the sunrise, and you are the sovereign of the sunset. Let there be between us a firm treaty of friendship and peace. The caravan crossed the deserts of Kazakhstan and arrived at the border town of Otrar in November 1218. It sat on the Sir Darya River, a crucial junction on the Silk Road. The markets were crowded with merchants. Camels watered after long desert crossings. It should have been a routine stop. But the governor of Otrar was a man named Inalchuk. He was the Shah's uncle, the brother of the Shah's powerful mother. He saw the Mongol caravan and its wealth, and he made a decision that would change history. He accused the merchants of being spies. He ordered them arrested. Their goods were seized and sent to Bukhara to be sold. The merchants themselves were executed. Inalchuk had just become very rich. And what were a bunch of barbarian horsemen 3,000 kilometers away going to do about it? When news reached Genghis Khan, he was enraged, but he was also pragmatic. Perhaps this was a mistake. Perhaps the Shah didn't know what his governor had done. He sent 3 ambassadors to the Shah's court with a simple demand: hand over Inalchuk for punishment, and peace would continue. The Shah refused, Worse, he had one of the ambassadors executed on the spot. The other two had their beards shaved, a profound insult, and were sent back to Mongolia. When the ambassadors returned, their faces shorn and humiliation burning in their eyes, Genghis Khan's rage was seismic. He climbed the sacred mountain Burkan Khaldun once more. For 3 days he prayed alone on the windswept peak. When he descended, he had his answer. I was not the author of this trouble. Grant me strength to exact vengeance. In 1219, the Mongol horde gathered, perhaps 200,000 horsemen, Chinese siege engineers, thousands of supply carts, 500,000 horses. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't even a war of conquest. This was retribution. The Persian historian Atamalik Juvaini would later write, in executing his command, he deprived these men of their lives and possessions. Nay, rather, he desolated and laid waste a whole world. For every drop of their blood, there would flow a whole river. In retribution for every hair on their heads, 100,000 heads would roll in the dust at every crossroad. The Mongols marched west. Ahead of them lay the greatest cities of the Islamic world, centers of learning, art, and commerce that had flourished for centuries. Behind them, they would leave silence. The merchant caravan had been worth perhaps a few 100,000 dinars. The cost of that greed would be measured in millions of lives and the destruction of an entire civilization. The spark had been lit. The world was about to burn. Between the Mongol armies and the heart of the Khwarazmian Empire lay 500 kilometers of red sand, the Kizilkum Desert. Its name means red sands in Turkic. It was a death trap. Even trade caravans skirted its edges. No army had ever crossed it. The cities of Bukhara and Samarkand sat on the far side, protected by this natural barrier. Their rulers knew the Mongols were coming. They had heard about the fall of Otrar, but they weren't worried. Let the barbarians try to cross the Kizilkum. The desert would kill them before they ever reached the walls. Genghis Khan had other plans. He left his sons to finish the siege of Otrar. Then he took 30,000 horsemen and rode straight into the desert. This wasn't recklessness. It was calculation. The Mongols had recruited local guides, men who knew the hidden water sources, the routes that caravans whispered about but rarely used. They crossed in winter, when morning dew formed on the sand, and small plants could sustain the horses. For weeks they moved through the wasteland. No campfires, no rest, just the endless red horizon and the sound of hooves on sand. On February 7th, 1220, the impossible happened. The Mongols emerged from the Kizilkum Desert like ghosts. They appeared outside the walls of Bukhara without warning. The city's garrison, 20,000 soldiers, looked out from the walls and saw the surrounding countryside choked with horsemen. The air turned black with dust. Detachment after detachment arrived, each like a billowing sea. The garrison panicked. They had expected weeks of warning. They had expected the Mongols to be exhausted, weakened, dying of thirst. Instead, the Mongols were fresh, organized, and ready to fight. That night, the garrison attempted to flee under cover of darkness. The Mongols spotted them immediately. By moonlight, they hunted down every soldier on the open plains. Not one escaped. The next morning, Bukhara's gates opened. The city surrendered in 3 days. Genghis Khan rode into the city, one of the only times he ever entered a walled settlement. He went straight to the Great Mosque, the largest building he could see. He assumed it was the Sultan's palace. When told it was the house of God, he dismounted and walked inside. His soldiers brought in cases containing Qurans and emptied them onto the courtyard. They used the cases as feeding troughs for their horses. Then Genghis Khan gathered the people of Bukhara in the mosque. The floor was still littered with scattered pages of holy text. He mounted the pulpit and spoke. "O people, know that you are great sinners, and your leaders are at the head of the pack in sin. You ask me why I say this. I say it because I am the scourge of God. If great sins had not been committed by you, the great God would not have sent you one like me as a torment." The people of Bukhara were spared. In exchange for their swift surrender, they kept their lives. But the city's walls were torn down. Its defenses were destroyed, and word spread across the Islamic world. The Mongols had crossed the impossible desert. No city was safe. After Bukhara fell, Genghis Khan turned toward the jewel of Central Asia, the city of Merv. Merv was known as the Queen of the World. 1 million people lived within its walls. Its libraries rivaled Baghdad's. Its orchards stretched for miles. Water flowed through channels that fed gardens where scholars debated beneath pomegranate trees. It was the largest city the Mongols had ever seen. The siege lasted 13 days. Chinese engineers bombarded the walls with stones and fire. When the gates finally opened, the Mongol commanders made a promise: "Surrender peacefully, and you will be spared." The people of Merv believed them. They filed out of the city, men, women, children, and gathered on the plain outside the walls. Then the killing began. The Mongols separated soldiers from civilians, men from women. Then they divided the population among their units. Each Mongol soldier was assigned a quota, 300 to 400 people. They worked methodically. Bodies were stacked in pyramids. The stench was visible for miles, a dark cloud that hung over the plain. When it was finished, Merv was empty. The irrigation channels were destroyed, the orchards burned, the libraries were ash. The city that had stood for more than 2,000 years was gone. But Merv was mercy compared to what came next. In 1221, the Mongols laid siege to Nishapur, the largest metropolitan city on the Silk Road. It sat in a fertile valley at the foot of the Binalud Mountains, a place so beautiful that Persian poets called it the paradise on earth. Nishapur surrendered quickly. The Mongols looted the treasury and left a small garrison behind. The siege was over. Then, during the occupation, a single arrow flew from the city walls. It struck a Mongol officer and killed him. His name was Tokuchar. He was Genghis Khan's son-in-law, married to one of the Khan's daughters. The Mongols returned in force. When the city fell a second time, Genghis Khan summoned his widowed daughter and told her she would decide Nishapur's fate. In her grief and rage, she gave a single order: total annihilation. The Mongols drove every survivor out onto the plain. Then they began to kill. They severed heads from bodies and sorted them into piles, men separate from women, women separate from children. The order was absolute. Not even cats and dogs were to be left alive. One account claims the Mongols plowed the ruins so thoroughly that the site could be planted with crops. The city was to be erased, not just destroyed, but forgotten. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir, writing from Mosul, captured the horror in words that still echo across the centuries. Would that my mother had not borne me, or that I had died before this. With one stroke, a world which billowed with fertility was laid desolate. The mighty were humbled. It is unlikely that mankind will see the like of this calamity until the world comes to an end and perishes. The destruction of Merv and Nishapur wasn't just military strategy. It was existential terror. A message written in blood across the landscape. Resist, and you will be erased from history. The Mongols had learned that fear was more powerful than any army. After Nishapur, cities across Persia opened their gates without a fight. The Great Reset had begun. The old world, the world of the Silk Road oases, of Islamic scholarship, of thriving trade, was being systematically dismantled. But the Mongols weren't just destroyers. They were builders of a new world order, and their next target would be the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age itself. In 1258, the Mongol general Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, stood at the gates of Baghdad with an army of perhaps 200,000 men. Baghdad wasn't just a city. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual and intellectual center of the Islamic world. For 500 years, it had been the beating heart of civilization. Its libraries held the accumulated knowledge of centuries, Greek philosophy translated into Arabic, Persian poetry, mathematical treatises, astronomical charts, medical texts. Scholars came from across the known world to study in its house of wisdom. The caliph who ruled Baghdad was named Al-Mustasim. He was the supreme religious figure across the Muslim world, somewhere between an emperor and a pope. Hulagu sent him an ultimatum. I will bring you crashing down from the summit of the sky. Like a lion, I will throw you down to the lowest depths. I will not leave a single person alive in your country. If you have the heart to save your head and your ancient family, listen carefully to my advice. The caliph refused. Baghdad's walls were 18 kilometers around, 12 meters high, broken by 12 gates and 900 guard towers. The city held nearly 1 million people. Its defenses had never been breached, but the Mongols had conquered cities before. They arrived in January 1258 and built a rampart completely surrounding Baghdad. Chinese engineers assembled their siege engines, but there was a problem. The Tigris River Valley was a salt flat. There was virtually no stone. The Mongols adapted. They cut down the heavy date palms that lined the riverbanks and loaded the trunks into their catapults. The people of Baghdad watched their own trees hurtling over the walls. The bombardment was relentless. Gunpowder bombs exploded on the ramparts. Pots of flaming naphtha set buildings ablaze. Within days, the eastern wall collapsed. On February 10th, 1258, the caliph surrendered. The Mongols entered the city. For 40 days, the killing continued. Streets became rivers of blood. The dead piled in mounds. Rain fell on the corpses. Horses trampled them into the mud. Some populations were spared. The Christians of Baghdad, protected because Hulagu's wife was a Nestorian Christian, survived. The Jews survived, but the Muslim population was decimated. The libraries burned. Centuries of accumulated knowledge went up in flames. Later sources, writing hundreds of years after the event, would claim that so many books were thrown into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink for days. This detail is almost certainly apocryphal, but it captured a deeper truth. Baghdad wasn't just destroyed, its intellectual legacy was shattered. When the slaughter ended, Hulagu summoned the Caliph. He set a golden tray before him and said, "Eat." The Caliph replied, "It is not edible." Hulagu asked, "Then why did you keep it and not give it to your soldiers? And why did you not make these iron doors into arrowheads and come to the bank of the river so that I might not have been able to cross it?" The Caliph had no answer. According to Mongol law, royal blood could not be spilled. So Hulagu had the Caliph rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled for 5 centuries, was over. The Islamic Golden Age, which had preserved and advanced human knowledge while Europe languished in the Dark Ages, came to an abrupt end. Baghdad would never recover its former glory. The city that had once rivaled Constantinople and Baghdad as a center of learning became a provincial town. But the Mongols weren't finished. With the heart of the Islamic world in ruins, they now controlled the entire length of the Silk Road, from Korea to the Mediterranean, and they had plans for it. With the conquest complete, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Poland, from the Arctic to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest continuous land empire in history. But size created a problem. How do you govern an empire so vast that a message from one end to the other would take months to deliver? Genghis Khan had an answer: the Yam. The Yam was a postal relay system unlike anything the world had ever seen. At 25-mile intervals across the entire empire, the Mongols built stations. Each station maintained fresh horses, food, and lodging. A messenger could ride into a station, dismount, grab a fresh horse, and continue without stopping. The system employed more than 300,000 horses. Messages could travel 200 miles per day, faster than any communication system until the telegraph. But the Yam wasn't just for official dispatches. It was infrastructure. Merchants could use it. Ambassadors could use it. Even foreign travelers, if they carried the right credentials. Those credentials were called paisa, tablets made of wood, bronze, silver, or gold, depending on the bearer's rank. A gold paisa granted the highest level of access. The bearer could commandeer horses, demand food and shelter, and travel freely across the empire. Marco Polo described the system with awe. If even a king were to arrive at one of these stations, he would find himself well lodged. The Yam connected the empire in real time. A Khan in Karakorum could send orders to a general in Persia and receive a reply within weeks. Tax collectors could report revenue. Governors could request reinforcements. Merchants could coordinate shipments across continents. Information flowed faster than it ever had in human history. But the Yam carried more than messages. It carried ideas. Chinese engineers traveled west to build siege engines in Persia. Persian astronomers traveled east to advise Mongol Khans. Muslim scholars debated with Buddhist monks in Karakorum. Christian missionaries from Europe reached the court of Kublai Khan in China. For the first time in history, the civilizations of East and West were in direct, continuous contact. The Yam also carried goods. Silk moved from China to Europe. Spices from India reached Russian markets. Persian carpets appeared in Chinese palaces. Venetian glass ended up in Korean temples. Trade exploded. Cities along the Silk Road, those that survived the conquest, began to prosper again. Merchants who had once risked banditry and war on every journey now traveled under Mongol protection. The Yasa law code guaranteed their safety. Bandits were executed. Thieves were hunted down. It was said that a maiden carrying a nugget of gold on her head could walk from one end of the empire to the other without being robbed. This was the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. But peace came at a cost. The same roads that carried silk and spices also carried something else, something invisible, something deadly. In the 1330s, reports began to filter back from the eastern provinces. A disease was spreading, one that killed quickly and without mercy. Victims developed hard lumps under their armpits or between their thighs. They coughed thin blood. Most died within days. The disease moved along the trade routes. It traveled with merchants. It rode with soldiers. It spread from city to city, following the very network the Mongols had built. By 1346, it reached the Mongol siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Black Sea. The Mongols were losing men to the plague. Bodies piled up in their camp. So they loaded the infected corpses into catapults and hurled them over the city walls. Whether this was the actual source of the Black Death spread into Europe is disputed. But what's certain is that Genoese ships fled Kaffa and sailed to Italy, carrying infected rats and fleas in their holds. By 1348, the plague had reached Florence, Venice, and Genoa. Within 5 years, it would kill between 75 and 200 million people, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. The Yam had connected the world. But in doing so, it had also created the first global pandemic. The Mongols had built the medieval internet, a system that transmitted information, goods, and culture across continents. It was the foundation of the modern globalized world. But like all networks, it carried both knowledge and catastrophe. The same roads that spread paper, gunpowder, and the compass also spread the plague that ended the Middle Ages and reshaped European society forever. The Mongols had unified the world, and in doing so, they had changed it beyond recognition. The Mongol Empire didn't just connect the world through roads and horses. It created the first true global exchange of technology, ideas, and culture. Before the Mongols, knowledge moved slowly. A Chinese invention might take centuries to reach Europe, if it ever did. The Islamic world and Christian Europe were locked in mutual hostility. India, and China traded goods, but rarely ideas. The Mongols shattered these barriers. Paper had been invented in China more than 1,000 years earlier, but it remained largely confined to East Asia. The Mongols changed that. As they conquered westward, Chinese papermakers were relocated to Samarkand. From there, the technology spread to Persia, then to the Arab world, and finally to Europe. By the 14th century, paper mills were operating in Italy and France. Within 200 years, Gutenberg would use paper to print the Bible, launching the printing revolution that would transform European society. Printing itself followed the same path. The Chinese had been using woodblock printing for centuries. The Mongols brought Chinese printers west. European craftsmen observed the technique, adapted it, and eventually developed movable type. Without the Mongol Empire, the printing press might have taken centuries longer to reach Europe. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, all depended on the mass production of books. All traced their roots back to knowledge that flowed along Mongol trade routes. Gunpowder was perhaps the most consequential transfer. The Chinese had been using gunpowder for fireworks and primitive weapons since the 9th century. The Mongols weaponized it. They brought Chinese engineers west to build fire lances, bombs, and early cannons. European armies encountered these weapons during the Mongol invasions of Poland and Hungary. They were terrified, but they were also fascinated. Within a century, European craftsmen had perfected the cannon. By the 15th century, gunpowder weapons had rendered medieval castles obsolete. The feudal system, which had dominated Europe for 1,000 years, began to collapse. Gunpowder also enabled European colonial expansion. The ships that sailed to the Americas carried cannons. The conquistadors who toppled the Aztec and Inca empires carried firearms. All of it traced back to Chinese technology transmitted by the Mongols. The compass followed a similar trajectory. Chinese sailors had been using magnetic compasses for navigation since the 11th century. The Mongols introduced the technology to Arab traders. Arab sailors refined it. European explorers adopted it. Without the compass, the age of exploration would have been impossible. Columbus, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, all depended on navigational tools that had traveled from China to Europe via the Mongol Empire. But the exchange wasn't one way. Ideas flowed east as well. Persian astronomers traveled to China and established observatories. They brought with them Arab mathematical techniques, including the concept of zero, which had originated in India. Chinese scholars studied Persian star charts and incorporated them into their own astronomical models. Muslim engineers built irrigation systems in China. Christian missionaries translated religious texts into Mongolian and Chinese. Buddhist monks from Tibet advised Mongol Khans on spiritual matters. The Mongol court at Karakorum became a crossroads of civilizations. Marco Polo described seeing merchants from Venice, scholars from Baghdad, monks from Tibet, and engineers from China, all gathered in the same city, all under the protection of Mongol law. Religious tolerance was perhaps the Mongols' most radical innovation. The Yasa law code guaranteed freedom of worship to all faiths. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Jews, and shamanists all received equal protection. This wasn't idealism, it was pragmatism. Religious conflicts had torn apart empires for centuries. By removing religion as a source of division, the Mongols created stability. But the policy had unintended consequences. It fostered intellectual exchange. Christian monks debated with Muslim scholars. Buddhist philosophers discussed metaphysics with Confucian bureaucrats. Ideas cross-pollinated in ways that had never been possible before. The Mongol Empire also standardized weights, measures, and currencies across vast distances. This made trade easier. Merchants no longer had to navigate dozens of different monetary systems. Contracts could be enforced across borders. Credit systems developed. In many ways, the Mongols created the first truly globalized economy. But there was a dark side to this exchange. The same roads that carried silk and spices also carried disease. The Black Death moved along Mongol trade routes, killing millions. The same military technologies that the Mongols spread, gunpowder, siege engines, organizational tactics, would be used by later empires to conquer and subjugate. The Mongols had opened Pandora's box. They'd connected the world in ways that could never be undone. The consequences, both brilliant and catastrophic, would echo for centuries. In 1260, a civil war tore through the Mongol Empire. The great Khan Mongke had died during the conquest of southern China, and his brothers fought over who would rule. The winner was Kublai, a man who would transform the Mongol Empire in ways his grandfather Genghis Khan could never have imagined. Kublai was born in 1215, the same year Genghis Khan sacked Beijing. He grew up not on the steppe, but in China. He learned to speak Chinese. He studied Confucian texts. He surrounded himself with Chinese advisors and Buddhist monks. To the traditional Mongols back in Karakorum, Kublai was suspect. He dressed in silk robes instead of leather and fur. He lived in a palace instead of a ger tent. He preferred wine to fermented mare's milk. When Kublai claimed the title of Great Khan, his younger brother Arik Boka challenged him. Arik Boka represented the old way, the nomadic steppe lifestyle, the warrior traditions, the felt-walled tents. The civil war lasted 4 years. Kublai won by cutting off Karakorum's food supply. The steppe capital, which had always depended on grain shipped from China, starved into submission. When Kublai's armies entered Karakorum, they looted it. The silver fountain that William Boucher had built, the mechanical tree that dispensed wine and kumis, was likely melted down and sent back to China. The symbolic message was clear. The age of the steppe was over. The future of the Mongol Empire lay in China. In 1271, Kublai made it official. He declared himself Emperor of China and founded a new dynasty, the Yuan, meaning the beginning or the origin. He moved his capital from Karakorum to a new city built near the ruins of Beijing. He called it Dadu, the great capital. The Mongols and Turks called it Khanbalik, the city of the Khan. Kublai built palaces of marble and jade. He extended the Grand Canal so rice could flow from the fertile south to the arid north. He established a paper currency system. He created a government bureaucracy staffed by Chinese officials. He became, in every way that mattered, a Chinese emperor. But he never forgot he was Mongol. He kept the Mongol military structure. He reserved the highest government positions for Mongols and Central Asians. He relegated the Chinese, especially those from the conquered south, to second-class citizenship in their own country. This hybrid system worked for a time. Kublai completed the conquest of southern China in 1279, becoming the first foreign ruler to unite the entire country. The Yuan dynasty controlled more territory and more people than any Chinese dynasty before it. But there was a cost. The traditional Mongols saw Kublai as a traitor who had abandoned the steppe. The Chinese saw him as a foreign occupier who had stolen their throne. Kublai tried to expand further. He launched invasions of Japan, Vietnam, and Java. All failed. The Mongol military machine, so effective on the steppe and in siege warfare, struggled in jungles and on the open sea. When Kublai died in 1294, he left behind an empire in crisis. His successors were weak, famine spread, corruption festered. The Chinese population began to see the Mongols not as conquerors, but as parasites. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty collapsed. A Chinese peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang, who had survived plague, famine, and war, led a rebellion that drove the Mongols out of China. The Mongols returned to the steppe. They packed up their courts, their treasures, their Chinese advisors, and rode north across the Gobi Desert. To them, it wasn't defeat. It was simply going home. But they left behind something permanent. Kublai had proven that the Mongols could do more than conquer. They could rule, they could administer, they could adapt. The Yuan dynasty lasted less than a century, but it established a template that would shape China for the next 600 years. A unified empire stretching from the steppe to the sea, governed by a centralized bureaucracy, connected by infrastructure that moved goods and information across vast distances. Kublai Khan had become Chinese, but in doing so, he had also made China Mongol. While Kublai Khan built marble palaces in China, another branch of the Mongol family ruled the western steppe. The lands of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. These were the descendants of Yochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son, the son whose name meant guest, the son whose paternity was always in doubt. They called themselves the Ulus of Yochi, the people of Yochi. But history would know them by another name, the Golden Horde. Their conquest of Russia had been swift and brutal. In 1240, they captured Kiev, the cultural and religious heart of the Slavic world. Out of 50,000 inhabitants, only 2,000 survived. But the Golden Horde didn't occupy Russia the way the Yuan dynasty occupied China. They didn't build new capitals or integrate into local culture. They remained nomads, moving across the steppe with their herds, living in felt tents, just as their ancestors had. Instead, they created a system of indirect rule. Russian princes kept their thrones, but only if they paid tribute. Every year, caravans of silver, furs, and slaves traveled south to the Mongol court. The tribute was crushing. Entire villages were emptied to meet the quota. Families sold their children into slavery to pay the tax collectors. Those who resisted were hunted down and executed. But one Russian city learned to profit from this system: Moscow. The Mongols appointed Moscow's princes as their chief tax collectors for all of Russia. Moscow gathered tribute from rival cities, skimmed off the top, and grew wealthy. While other Russian principalities weakened, Moscow strengthened. The Mongols also reshaped Russian political culture. Before the conquest, Russian city-states had been relatively democratic. Princes were elected. Town councils made decisions collectively. Power was distributed. The Mongols changed that. They demanded centralized authority, one ruler who could guarantee tribute, maintain order, and crush rebellion. Russian princes who adopted this model thrived. Those who clung to the old ways were replaced. Over time, Russian autocracy emerged, a system of absolute power concentrated in one ruler, backed by a ruthless bureaucracy and secret police. The model was Mongol. Even the Russian language absorbed Mongol words. Money, customs, postal systems, all borrowed Mongol terminology. The Russian word for money, denga, comes from the Mongol tenge. The word for customs, tamga, is pure Mongol. In 1480, after 240 years of Mongol rule, Moscow finally refused to pay tribute. The Mongol envoys arrived expecting gold and furs. Instead, they were turned away. The Golden Horde was too weak to respond. Internal divisions had fractured it into competing khanates. The age of Mongol dominance was over. But the legacy remained. The Russian state that emerged, centralized, autocratic, expansionist, was fundamentally shaped by Mongol governance. Ivan the Terrible, who would later crown himself the first Tsar of Russia, ruled like a Mongol Khan. He maintained absolute power. He used terror to crush opposition. He expanded Russian territory eastward across the steppe, conquering the remnants of Mongol Khanates one by one. Russia became an empire by adopting Mongol methods and turning them against their former masters. The irony is profound. Russians remember the Mongol period as the Tatar yoke, a time of oppression and humiliation. Monuments commemorate resistance. History books emphasize suffering. But the political DNA of the Russian state, its centralized power, its bureaucratic control, its expansionist drive, all trace back to the Mongol occupation. The Golden Horde is gone, but its ghost still haunts the Kremlin. In Persia, the transformation was different and more creative. Hulagu Khan, the destroyer of Baghdad, established his capital at Marageh in northwestern Iran. His descendants would rule Persia for nearly a century as the Ilkhanate, the subordinate Khanate that theoretically answered to the Great Khan in China. But within 2 generations, something remarkable happened. The Mongols became Persian. Hulagu's grandson, Ghazan Khan, converted to Islam in 1295. He adopted Persian dress, Persian customs, Persian court rituals. He patronized Persian poets and commissioned Persian manuscripts. The Mongols who had burned libraries now became their greatest patrons. Ghazan Khan appointed a Persian scholar named Rashid al-Din as his vizier. Rashid al-Din was a polymath, a physician, historian, and administrator. Ghazan gave him an extraordinary commission: write a history of the entire world. The result was the Compendium of Chronicles, the first attempt at a truly global history. It covered the Mongols, the Chinese, the Arabs, the Persians, the Indians, the Franks, and the Jews. It drew on sources in multiple languages. It included maps, genealogies, and illustrations. The manuscript was copied and distributed across the empire. It became the foundation for how the Mongols understood their own place in history. The Ilkhans also revolutionized Persian art. They brought Chinese painters to Persia. Persian miniaturists studied Chinese techniques, the use of perspective, the depiction of landscapes, the rendering of horses in motion. A hybrid style emerged, Persian subjects painted with Chinese methods. These illuminated manuscripts would later influence Mughal art in India, creating a visual legacy that endures today. The Ilkhans funded observatories. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the greatest astronomers of the medieval period, built an observatory at Marageh with Mongol patronage. He calculated the length of the year to within 1 second of modern measurements. His astronomical tables would be used for centuries. Persian physicians translated Greek medical texts that had been preserved in Arabic. These translations eventually reached Europe, where they became the foundation of Renaissance medicine. The irony was complete. The destroyers of Baghdad became the preservers of Islamic knowledge. But the Ilkhanate was fragile. It depended on trade, on tribute, on the loyalty of Persian bureaucrats who administered the empire, while the Mongol elite remained semi-nomadic. In 1335, the last Ilkhan died without an heir. The empire fractured immediately into competing warlords. Persia descended into chaos. But the cultural legacy survived. The Persian language, which the Mongols had elevated to a language of administration and literature, remained dominant. The architectural innovations, the use of glazed tiles, the construction of massive domes, became hallmarks of Islamic architecture. The Mongols had conquered Persia with fire and sword. But Persia had conquered the Mongols with culture. In 1346, a Mongol army of the Golden Horde laid siege to Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula, on the shores of the Black Sea. Kaffa was a wealthy city. Genoese merchants traded silks from China, spices from India, and furs from Russia. Its walls were strong. Its garrison was well supplied. The siege dragged on for months. Then something went wrong in the Mongol camp. Soldiers began to fall ill. They developed hard lumps under their armpits and between their thighs. They coughed blood. Most died within days. The disease spread through the camp like wildfire. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The Mongols were losing more men to sickness than to combat. The Mongol commanders made a decision. If they couldn't take the city by force, they would take it by disease. They loaded infected corpses into their catapults and hurled them over the walls. Whether this actually happened is disputed by historians. The account comes from a Genoese notary named Gabriele de Musi, who may not have been present. Some scholars think he embellished the story. But what's certain is this: the plague reached Kaffa, and Genoese ships fled the city in panic. They sailed to Constantinople, then to Sicily, then to Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. In their holds, they carried infected rats and fleas. By 1348, the plague had reached Florence, then Paris, then London. The symptoms were horrific. Victims developed black swellings the size of eggs. The swellings burst and oozed pus. Some victims coughed blood. Others developed dark blotches across their skin, hence the name Black Death. Most died within 3 to 5 days. The speed of the spread was unprecedented. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities lost half their population. In some regions, mortality reached 80%. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio described Florence in 1348. The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They sickened by the thousands daily, and died unattended and without help. Many died in the open street. Others, dying in their houses, made it known by the stench of their rotting bodies. The death toll was staggering. Modern estimates suggest the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people worldwide, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. The social consequences were even more profound. The feudal system collapsed. With so many peasants dead, labor became scarce. Survivors could demand higher wages. Lords who had once wielded absolute power found themselves negotiating with their workers. The church's authority weakened. People had prayed for deliverance. God had not answered. Faith wavered. Heretical movements spread. The economy transformed. Trade routes shifted. New industries emerged. The old order, the medieval world of knights and serfs, of rigid hierarchies and unchanging traditions, began to crack. Historians debate whether the Mongol siege of Kaffa truly introduced the plague to Europe. The disease may have arrived through other routes. Rats and fleas traveled on many ships, not just those fleeing Kaffa. But the larger truth is undeniable. The Black Death moved along Mongol trade routes. The same roads that had carried silk, spices, and knowledge from east to west also carried the deadliest pandemic in human history. The Yuan postal system, the medieval internet that connected the world, had become a highway for disease. The Mongols had unified Eurasia. They had created the first global economy. They had made it possible for goods, ideas, and people to move freely across continents. But they had also made it possible for a plague that began in the steppes of Central Asia to reach the heart of Europe within months. The Pax Mongolica had connected the world, but in doing so, it had also made the world vulnerable in ways that had never been possible before. The Black Death was the price of globalization, and it would reshape European society more profoundly than any conquest ever could. In 1368, the Mongol Yuan dynasty collapsed. A Chinese peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang, orphaned by plague and famine, led a rebellion that drove the Mongols back across the Gobi Desert. He crowned himself the Hongwu Emperor and founded the Ming Dynasty. The name meant brilliant or bright, a deliberate contrast to the darkness of Mongol rule. The Ming faced a traumatized nation. Northern China had been devastated by decades of war. The south had been conquered and occupied. Millions had died from plague. The economy was in ruins. But worse than the physical damage was the psychological wound. For the first time in Chinese history, foreigners had ruled the entire country. The humiliation was unbearable. The Ming response was radical. Turn inward. Close the borders. Rebuild the walls. China had built defensive fortifications for more than 1,000 years. But the Ming took it to an unprecedented scale. They constructed what we now know as the Great Wall, a continuous barrier stretching nearly 9,000 kilometers across northern China. The project consumed the Ming Dynasty. It required an estimated 100 million tons of building material, the equivalent of building the Great Pyramid of Giza nearly 50 times. Millions of workers were conscripted. Many died during construction, buried in the walls they built, according to legend. The economic cost was staggering. But the Ming had made a choice. They would spend their resources on defense, not exploration. They would build walls, not ships. This decision had consequences. The Ming had inherited one of the largest naval fleets in the world. In the early 15th century, Chinese treasure ships, massive vessels larger than anything Europe could build, sailed to India, Arabia, and East Africa. But the wall consumed the budget. The Ming dismantled much of the fleet. Some ships were burned in harbor to save money. Exploration stopped. China turned its back on the sea. The irony is profound. While China built walls to keep the Mongols out, Europe, which had never been conquered by the Mongols, was building ships to explore the world. The technologies the Mongols had spread, gunpowder, the compass, printing, were all reaching their full potential in Europe, not in China. The Ming had won their freedom, but they had lost their future. The Great Wall became a monument to fear, a symbol of a civilization that had been so traumatized by invasion that it chose isolation over engagement. The Mongols were gone, but their shadow stretched across centuries. Here's the paradox that shaped the modern world. Europe, the continent that suffered the least from Mongol conquest, gained the most from the Mongol Empire. Poland and Hungary were devastated by raids in the 1240s. Russia endured 2.5 centuries of tribute and occupation. But Western Europe, France, England, Spain, Italy, Portugal, escaped almost entirely. The Mongol armies reached the gates of Vienna and then turned back. They raided into Germany and then withdrew. They never crossed the Rhine. They never saw Paris or London. Western Europe watched the destruction from a safe distance. And then they reaped the rewards. The technologies that flowed along Mongol trade routes, gunpowder, printing, the compass, all arrived in Europe without the accompanying conquest. Europeans didn't pay tribute. They didn't lose their cities. They simply received the knowledge. Paper reached Italy through Mongol-controlled trade routes. By the 14th century, paper mills were operating across Europe. Within 200 years, Gutenberg would use paper to print the Bible, launching a revolution in literacy and learning. The printing press itself was inspired by Chinese woodblock printing, transmitted westward by Mongol merchants and craftsmen. By 1500, European presses had produced more than 20 million books. Knowledge that had once been confined to monasteries and universities became accessible to anyone who could read. Gunpowder arrived the same way. European armies first encountered gunpowder weapons during the Mongol invasions of the 1240s. They were terrified by the explosions, the smoke, the noise. But they were also fascinated. Within a century, European craftsmen had perfected the cannon. By the 15th century, gunpowder artillery could demolish any medieval fortress. The feudal system, which had dominated Europe for 1,000 years, began to collapse. Kings with cannons could break the power of rebellious nobles. Centralized nation-states emerged. Gunpowder also enabled European colonial expansion. The ships that sailed to the Americas carried cannons. The conquistadors who toppled the Aztec and Inca empires carried firearms. European imperialism, which would dominate the world for the next 5 centuries, was built on Chinese technology transmitted by Mongol trade routes. The compass followed the same pattern. Chinese magnetic compasses reached Arab sailors through Mongol intermediaries. Arab traders brought them to Mediterranean ports. European navigators refined the technology and used it to cross the Atlantic. Without the compass, Columbus would never have reached the Americas. Magellan would never have circumnavigated the globe. Vasco da Gama would never have reached India. by sea. The age of exploration, which reshaped the entire planet, depended on a Chinese invention that traveled west along Mongol roads. But Europe gained something else from the Mongol Empire, something less tangible, but equally important. They gained knowledge of the wider world. Marco Polo's Travels was published around 1300 and became an immediate sensation. It described the wealth of China, the splendor of Mongol courts, the vastness of Asia. It was translated into multiple languages and reprinted continuously for centuries. Christopher Columbus owned a copy. He annotated it obsessively. He dreamed of reaching the court of the great Khan that Marco Polo had described. When he sailed west in 1492, he carried the book with him. Columbus never reached China. He stumbled upon the Americas instead. But his voyage was inspired by the Mongol Empire, by the vision of a connected world where distant civilizations could be reached by determined travelers. The Mongol conquest had opened European minds to the possibility of global contact. For centuries, Europeans had lived in relative isolation, cut off from the great civilizations of Asia. The Mongol Empire changed that. Suddenly, Europe was part of a world system. And there was one final gift the Mongols gave to Europe, though this one came wrapped in catastrophe. The Black Death, which killed a third of Europe's population, arrived via Mongol trade routes. The devastation was horrific, but the aftermath transformed European society. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Peasants who had once been tied to the land could now demand wages. Serfs became free workers. The rigid hierarchies of feudalism began to break down. The church's authority weakened. People had prayed for deliverance from the plague. God had not answered. Faith wavered. New religious movements emerged. The seeds of the Reformation were planted. The economy restructured. With fewer workers, productivity became more valuable. Investment in technology increased. Labor-saving devices spread. The foundations of capitalism began to take shape. Historians debate whether the Renaissance would have happened without the Black Death. The plague created labor shortages that drove wages up and broke feudal bonds. It weakened the church's grip on intellectual life. It created economic conditions that rewarded innovation. The Black Death was a catastrophe. But it also cleared away the old order and made space for something new. The Mongols had connected the world. They had transmitted technologies that would enable European dominance. They had spread a plague that would reshape European society. And they had done it all without ever conquering Western Europe. The English philosopher Francis Bacon, writing in the 17th century, identified 3 inventions that had changed the whole face and state of things throughout the world. Those 3 inventions were printing, gunpowder, and the compass. All 3 had originated in China. All 3 had reached Europe via Mongol trade routes. And all 3 had enabled Europe to dominate the planet for the next 5 centuries. The Mongols had built the largest land empire in history. But their greatest legacy wasn't the territory they conquered. It was the world system they created. The network of roads, the exchange of technologies, the mixing of cultures. That system survived long after the Mongol Empire collapsed. It became the foundation of the modern globalized world. and the greatest beneficiaries were the people who had never been conquered at all. Today, Mongolia is a nation caught between worlds. In 1921, after centuries of Chinese rule, Mongolia declared independence, with Soviet help. The price was steep. For 70 years, Mongolia became a Soviet satellite state. Stalin's shadow stretched across the steppe. The Soviets banned the name of Genghis Khan. Speaking it could get you arrested. Teaching about him was forbidden. Monasteries were destroyed. Buddhist monks were executed. Thousands died in purges, simply for being descendants of the royal line, or for being herders who refused collectivization. The Soviets wanted to erase Mongol identity and replace it with socialist ideology. They nearly succeeded. But in 1990, everything changed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Mongolia held its first democratic elections, and the Mongol people did something extraordinary. They went to Sukhbatar Square, the main plaza in Ulaanbaatar, and they sang. They prayed to Genghis Khan. They asked forgiveness for ignoring him. They asked forgiveness for everything they had done wrong in the 20th century. Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of survival. Today his face is everywhere. On the currency, on vodka bottles, on the airport. There's a 40-meter-tall statue of him on horseback, rising from the steppe like a steel ghost. It's the largest equestrian statue in the world. But modern Mongolia faces challenges Genghis Khan never imagined. The population is 3 million. Half of them live in one city, Ulaanbaatar. The capital has exploded in size since 1990, swelling from 500,000 to 1.5 million in just 3 decades. The downtown is modern. Tall buildings, internet cafes, shopping malls. But surrounding the city center is the GER district, nearly 1 million people living in traditional felt tents, heating with coal, hauling water from communal taps, navigating unpaved streets. The urbanization happened too fast. 600,000 herders moved to the city in the 1990s and 2000s, driven by harsh winters that killed their livestock. They arrived with no jobs, no housing, no infrastructure to support them. They brought their gers, the felt tents that had sheltered Mongols for millennia. The ger is efficient on the steppe. It's mobile, insulated, designed for a nomadic life. But in the city, it's an energy disaster. In winter, temperatures drop to -40. Families burn cheap coal to stay warm. The result is catastrophic air pollution. In winter, Ulaanbaatar has some of the worst air quality on Earth. Worse than Beijing. Worse than Delhi. Children growing up in the GER districts have half the lung capacity of children in the countryside. The smoke hangs over the city like a shroud. You can taste it. It burns your throat. Hospital visits spike. People wear masks just to walk outside. There's a deeper problem too. The transition from nomadic life to urban life is brutal. Herders who once moved freely across the steppe now live in a city with traffic rules, property lines, and social hierarchies they don't understand. Mongolians joke about it. We don't know how to stand in line. We don't know how to wait for a green light. We were born to ride in every direction. The culture clash creates friction. Young people educated in the city can't find partners. Women are more educated than men. A legacy of nomadic culture, where families sent daughters to universities while sons stayed home to herd livestock. Now, there's a gender imbalance in education and employment. Mongolian women outnumber men in universities. They dominate white-collar professions. But many struggle to find partners they consider equals. The traditional nomadic lifestyle is vanishing. Only 30% of Mongolians still herd livestock. Motorcycles have replaced horses. Solar panels power gers. Herders check livestock prices on smartphones, but the identity remains. Mongolians still see themselves as nomads, even those who've never lived on the steppe. The culture is rooted in mobility, in hospitality, in the open sky. Throat singing, the haunting vocal technique where singers produce two notes at once, still echoes across the grasslands. Long songs, with their elongated vowels and poetic lyrics, are still sung at festivals. The Morin Khur, the horsehead fiddle, still plays at weddings and celebrations. And the Bankar, the ancient Mongolian livestock guardian dog, still protects herds from wolves and snow leopards, just as it did 15,000 years ago. Mongolia today is a paradox. It's a modern democracy with a free press, contested elections, and a thriving civil society. But it's also a nation grappling with its past, with the trauma of Soviet occupation, with the legacy of Genghis Khan, with the tension between tradition and modernity. The mining boom brought wealth, but also corruption. Foreign companies extract copper, coal, and gold from Mongolian soil. The profits rarely reach ordinary Mongolians. Inequality widens. The gap between the rich in downtown Ulaanbaatar and the poor in the Ger district grows every year. Young Mongolians look to the future with ambition and anxiety. They study abroad. They start businesses. They create art that blends traditional throat singing with heavy metal, traditional dance with contemporary performance. But they also look back to Genghis Khan, to the empire that once stretched from Korea to Poland, to the time when Mongols shaped the world. The question they ask is the same question their ancestors asked. What does it mean to be Mongol in a world that has moved on? The steppe is still there. The horses are still there. The gers are still there. But the world around them has changed beyond recognition. Mongolia survived Soviet occupation. It survived Chinese rule. It survived the collapse of empires and the rise of new ones. It survived by holding on to its identity, even when that identity was forbidden. Today, Mongolia is independent, democratic, and free. But it's also struggling to reconcile its nomadic past with its urban future. The shadow of Genghis Khan looms large, both as inspiration and as burden. The Mongols changed the world once. The question now is whether they can change themselves, whether they can adapt to modernity without losing what makes them Mongol. The answer is still being written. The Mongols didn't just conquer the world. They smashed the barriers between civilizations, creating the first truly global system, a medieval worldwide web of commerce, knowledge, and disease. Can we celebrate the Pax Mongolica, the explosion of trade, the spread of technology, the mixing of cultures, without acknowledging the genocides that enabled it? Can we admire the postal system without remembering the cities it connected were built on ruins? Return to Merv, to the silence, to the wind over the steppe, to the bones still buried in the sand. The modern world was forged in fire, blood, and the hoofbeats of Mongol horses. We live in the world they created, connected, globalized, vulnerable. For better and for worse, We are all children of the Mongol Empire.